What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, did you realize, and I never did, that our founders had the vision and the foresight to imagine that we would need protections in the event of extending ourselves too much, and thus the concept of bankruptcy is literally written into the Constitution?
I did not know that. Whereabouts is that written?
Well, I don't have chapter and verse, though Samuel Gerdano, who is our guest today, does. But it's just so important to understand that this is a natural chain of events when you've got an entrepreneurial society. And let's be honest, I would imagine that the English and common law, they had already taken all this into account. I mean, let's go back to Charles Dickens and Tale of Two Cities. Yes. We see people going broke. So that's not a new circumstance in a modern age.
No, it's not by any means.
So in America, where we've got a lot of risk takers, you would imagine that we'd also want to recognize the potential that many of those risks were just too far ahead of their time, or they were undercapitalized, or whatever. But we want to make certain that perhaps people can get back on their feet.
I think that's a worthy thing to do.
Well, I saw this headline, John, bankruptcy filings rising across the country, and it could get worse. That got my attention, and I said, well, if that's a trend in our society, let's run it down for our listeners. We want people to recognize that there are many risks today, but we also don't want people to be shy about imagining their dream. How many people have we seen start out in a garage and build Apple or Microsoft or whatever?
Absolutely. No, we gotta help them out, but I didn't realize with the economy, if you hear the news, the economy is doing well, and yet bankruptcies are on the rise.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it is really just starting to rise. They had been going down after the Great Recession. So I don't want to point to this and say, well, this is inevitably where we're headed, but we've got to be mindful, because this is going on both in business and in the lives of people listening to this podcast. We know that household debt has hit a new high in America, which some might argue is a new low in our society. So people are taking on because, well, they read the headlines, things are going well, so they began to extend themselves a little bit beyond their skis. And so that, too, is going on. But what a guest we have. Samuel Gerdano, the executive director of the American Bankruptcy Institute. Now, you might say, we have a bankruptcy institute?
Yeah, that's what I say.
No, I'll tell you, when I began looking at their website, they are a serious organization, and they provide Congress and regulatory agencies with a lot of information as they build policy. And in fact, we're going to be talking about some new laws in America just on the books. Actually, Congress got something done in a bipartisan way. You haven't heard about it, but it does benefit many people as it relates to bankruptcy. And that was a really important head scratcher to me, because I didn't think anything was getting done in Congress.
Stuff is getting done. Stuff is getting done.
But this is good.
Yeah, no, this is good. I'm glad that we got some good stuff coming. But stuff is being done. We just don't hear about it.
Okay. Well,
we
maybe
hear
things
Congress is doing nothing.
Nothing. Well, we wanted to unpack what was happening with debt in our society, as well as bankruptcy as a concept, how it works, what's going on today, both with individuals and businesses. Is it a life-changing experience, and in what way? And who is served by the process? I don't know, John, if you ever thought about this, but I wondered, I mean, is it the debtor? Is it the creditor? Is it society? Who gets left holding the bag? Because if you did go out on a limb and you go to bankruptcy court and you chapter 9, 13, 11, whatever chapter it is, and you say to yourself, well, how does that all work, this kind of workout? Now, I saw this very interesting part of Big Little Lies on HBO, where the husband overextended and was doing some very nefarious things. And this woman who loved her Monterey lifestyle, and all of a sudden they're in bankruptcy court, and they're asking her about her rings and about everything that she has bought in the last 30 years, wondering whether they were going to confiscate that. So you say to yourself, through this process, who's served? Is it the person who you owe the money to? Is it the person who owes the money? What kind of workouts? How do you start over again? It's a fascinating process. It really is.
I never thought about that, but yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's got to be some program that you as the debtor have to still be in debt somehow to them, at least pay something on the bill.
Right, but if you're a creditor, is something, a fraction of what it is that you're owed, really going to satisfy you? Well, who better to ask than Samuel Gerdano, again, from the American Bankruptcy Institute.
With me on the line on America Trends is Samuel Gerdano, and he is the executive director of a group called the American Bankruptcy Institute. And Sam, just before we begin, tell us what the Institute was set up to do. I know it's been several decades now, but tell us the rationale for having an American Bankruptcy Institute.
Sure. Happy to do that, Larry, and thank you for the opportunity. The ABI is the world's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan professional association dealing with issues related to bankruptcy and insolvency. We are a membership association of more than 10,000 members, and we're based here in the Washington, D.C. area, and we've typically been involved in policy issues, being a resource for Congress and the courts on issues related to bankruptcy. We do educational programs for our members, and I have a very popular website and programming that all is aimed at keeping our members informed about what's going on in the bankruptcy space.
Bankruptcy seems like a really complicated process to most of us who thankfully have not been in it. Is it complicated?
It is. It is a code. Bankruptcy actually goes back to the earliest part of our founding. It's in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution provides that Congress may provide for a uniform law on bankruptcy. And since about 1800, there have been bankruptcy laws on the books. And the purpose has traditionally been to encourage a fresh economic start for the honest but unfortunate debtor, whether they be an individual with household debt or a business, a corporation. And historically, more people actually are touched by the bankruptcy system than any other part of the federal court system. And that's because the cases, in some cases, we've had over 1 million filings, and one year we had over 2 million filings. And so it does impact a lot of folks, not just as a debtor or creditor, but because they're impacted by perhaps a company that files for bankruptcy, that they are a customer of, or an employee or a retiree. It really does have a big impact on the economy. It is America's commercial court.
That's really interesting because when we think about it, we're often, when we talk about bankruptcy, thinking about the debtor in this case. But then again, you're reminding us of all the creditors involved in this process. Exactly.
And then, of course, there are more creditors impacted than there are debtors, exponentially so. So it is impactful, and that's why it's important that we do a lot of stuff with the media as well to try to encourage a better understanding of how bankruptcy works. To perhaps dispel some misconceptions or myths about it. So it's an important part of our commercial system.
Absolutely. And that's why on America Trends, we look at where we're going as a society. And I know you have been very instrumental in some changes in bankruptcy, and we're going to talk about that later. But we're also all seeing headlines. Bankruptcy filings rising across the country, and it could get worse. More people are getting into debt and unable to repay their loans. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, historically, bankruptcy filings, because 98% of them are filed by individuals with household debt, are very correlative to what's going on in the household sector, which is to say that as consumers spend, they tend to add to their household debt burden. And we need consumers to do that. Consumer spending is 2/3 of GDP. So we need consumers pulling on the rope to produce a strong economy. And they've done that over the last couple of years. And what that does as a byproduct is it can make individuals and families vulnerable to needing bankruptcy protection if some adverse economic event occurs, a job loss, a family breakup, a uninsured medical expense, the kinds of things that people that experience all the time. And so as historically, as consumers have helped drive and expand an economy, it actually pulls bankruptcy filings up with it. Not immediately, but subsequently. And that's what we're seeing a little bit now. Bankruptcy filings actually for 8 straight years since the wake of the last recession in 2010 have actually declined. And that's because our economy was puttering along. We had low GDP growth, low interest rates, which is helpful, but an economy that wasn't as robust as it had been perhaps in the 90s or the 80s, both periods of high consumer spending, which in turn elevated bankruptcy filings.
In a sense, is it possible, because we know that this is a society built on consumer spending.
Right.
I think it's about 70% of the economy, and we see a lot of pull of people trying to get us to spend a lot of money.
Right.
When we do hear good macroeconomic news, and it has been relatively good overall, do people get a little more confident and do they apply it to their own situations, even if, in fact, their own situations might be a little bit more precarious, but they're encouraged to spend more?
Yes, there is some of that. It's hard to measure empirically, but when you see things like consumer confidence statistics and trends, people tend to be more optimistic, and that may influence their own personal spending habits. We are spenders, but we are not great at savings. Our savings rate in the United States historically has been really pretty low compared to other economies, and again, that creates the danger zone for when some setback occurs. And typically it's a job loss. That's the biggest factor that can lead to a bankruptcy filing.
I read recently where the Chinese are much better at savings, and some were suggesting that they're more prepared for a potential trade war to go on for a longer period, because the American public, as you say, it's not our culture to be great savers. Do you see any of these kinds of approaches in the way we look at money as affecting the way economic policy is built or public policy, recognizing America's proclivity to spend?
Yeah, I think so. America is obviously an entrepreneurial economy. It's a capitalist system built on sort of entrepreneurship. Historically, there are many, many illustrations of successful business people who failed, sometimes failed repeatedly, but had the opportunity to restructure debts through bankruptcy or other means, and that's kind of the culture. It is. It's a very different culture than some of the other nations of the world, including the Chinese economy. It is how we are, and the law is attempting to model, mirror, the way our system is built, and it's built for creation, but also failure.
Interesting. We'll talk about that. Samuel Gerdano is with us from the American Bankruptcy Institute. And you talked about job loss, but I was reading that the statistics also suggest that people are twice as likely to file for bankruptcy if their health insurance has been interrupted. How important is the healthcare piece to this discussion of bankruptcy?
Well, it is. There have been a number of studies which suggest the point you raise that American households, because again there perhaps is less savings than there might otherwise be, and they're very dependent on their health insurance, which they get through a job. So you lose your job, you might lose your health insurance, or there's a gap in coverage. That makes them very sensitive when there is an unexpected, uninsured medical expense. So you do find, when you look at the cases of individuals who file, you do find a fair amount of medical debt. Now, keep in mind, a lot of medical debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy. It's not secured debt typically, and in a typical bankruptcy, debts owed to healthcare providers are dischargeable. Indeed, the healthcare system, providers, hospitals, nursing homes, other folks in the medical industry are also under financial distress. There have been a lot of failures of healthcare systems throughout the United States because of this ability of the debts to be flushed in a bankruptcy proceeding.
That's interesting. I've got to tell you, I have a friend who's been going through lots of health issues that are chronic, and he's been back and forth between hospitals and nursing homes and such, and he's about 77 years old. So I said to him, well, what are you doing? Because he said, all these bills, my wife just keeps getting all these bills, and I'm not even home to deal with them. I said, what do you tell her to do with them? And he said, I tell her to throw them out. Yeah. I mean, I know that sounds terrible, right, but people throw up their hands because they're so confused in many cases about the medical billing process, and they recognize there's no way for them to pay that which is their copay or their responsibility in many cases.
Right. Ultimately, it falls to the provider. You can't be denied health care, by a hospital, for example, and emergency rooms deal with this every day of the week. And those are going to be losses, and it does leaves a mark. There have been, as I said, a number of entire healthcare systems which have gone into bankruptcy. Some hospitals have gone out of business, left communities, which is really a struggle for smaller and rural communities in particular, who will lose their major healthcare provider because the economics just are not sustainable.
Absolutely. Now, this might be a good time for us to discuss when we hear, someone has gone into bankruptcy or a company has gone into bankruptcy, but they are trying to settle, reorganize. Explain what that really means in the process. I mean, how devastating a situation is bankruptcy, or how recoverable based on this notion of a fresh start?
Right. Well, it is certainly not uncommon. This year we'll have close to probably 800,000 new bankruptcy cases filed. Again, most of them by individuals with household debt, about 98% of the cases. But there are a lot of public and private companies that file for bankruptcy as well, and you read about them in the daily paper, and some of them are quite familiar brands that folks have used, stores that they've shopped at, airlines that they've flown on, and the like. And for those, largely, the bankruptcy law, Chapter 11 in particular, allows those companies the opportunity to carry on business as close to usual as possible. It allows them to put a freeze on efforts to collect what they owe through the automatic stay of bankruptcy. And then it gives them a chance to work out with their creditors a restructuring of their balance sheet, or an opportunity for them to perhaps be sold to another competitor or another buyer on the open market. So for an individual who shops at a store that they read goes into bankruptcy, if you show up the next day, you probably won't notice much different. If you have a gift card from that retailer, I would encourage you to spend it promptly, because that is a debt that could be discharged in a bankruptcy. But for the most part, you won't notice a difference, because the law does allow for this breathing space for the company to try to reorganize their debts. And sometimes the cases involve really quite momentous situations. One case in particular that's now in bankruptcy is the case of PG&E, the electric provider, energy provider in California, which went into bankruptcy as a consequence of the fires. that they may be responsible for, and as a way to stop all of the litigation in federal and state court, the company filed for bankruptcy. Now, customers still get their power from PG&E, but it creates a different set of legal rules for the company. They have to operate differently when they're in bankruptcy than not. But for customers, there is an immediate effect that you would notice.
We hear about Chapter 11, then we also hear about Chapter 13, and these are chapters we'd like to skip in the Book of Life if we could. But what is the difference, very simply?
Well, Chapter 11 is mostly for businesses, again, public or private companies. There's a smaller number of these cases filed each year, far smaller number, but they do tend to be significant because they have, again, customers, employees, retirees. They have obligations in their communities, tax obligations and the like. So they're significant. The cases tend to be complicated. They tend to take years, potentially, to resolve. They're significant. They are more likely than not to be either the company's either sold or finds another buyer on the open market. Mostly because the capital structures these days are so complex and the debt is so heavy that a traditional kind of restructuring that we may have seen 15 or 20 years ago just doesn't work. Those are companies that essentially disappear, and that clearly has happened, and it's very consequential for communities. And as I said, the employees, retirees, pensioners, and the like, it's very impactful. Other types of bankruptcies are really more aimed at aligned to the consumer. Chapter 13 is a little bit different than Chapter 7 because it's designed to allow for a restructuring of personal financial affairs of someone who has a regular income. So they have a job, which can fund a repayment plan, typically 3 to 5 years, again, pursuant to a schedule. So the old debts are pushed aside, and then the new debts, the debts going forward, are determined pursuant to the plan, which is proposed by the debtor and approved by the court, and that becomes the new legal arrangement between the finances of creditor and debtor. Chapter 13 cases are about 30% of the total of the filing piece these days. That's been pretty consistent, and they can be very effective in terms of improving one's credit availability in the future. You would tend to have more credit available if you've been through a successful Chapter 13 than a straight Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And that's because the law wants to, encourage repayment of debts from individuals who have the capacity to repay their debts over time.
Now, when we look at it, we hear of various forms of debt. And I'm wondering in what escalating or de-escalating order they would necessarily, in some kind of workout, be allowed to collect a portion on a new schedule. We hear about revolving credit card debt. A lot of people get themselves into trouble. We hear a lot these days, even in the presidential campaign, about college loan debt. And, of course, the home mortgage is the king or queen of them all. So when somebody knows they're in trouble, and you might even tell us how somebody really knows they're in over their head and they really need to look at bankruptcy. But then what happens from that point on in terms of all of those obligations in whatever order you can tackle that?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there, so let me try. First, in terms of your own individual household finances, and again, we are overwhelmingly talking about individuals with household debt. If you just can't make payments on your expenses as they come due and have not been saving even a modest amount on a month-to-month basis, there's probably something wrong, and that would need to be adjusted. Typically, one of those big life events, like a job loss, is going to trigger relatively soon financial pressure. You're going to start missing payments. There'll be delinquency notice. If you're late on a few car payments, you may be in danger of a repossession. Certainly, if you are late on mortgage payments, you're going to be in danger of a foreclosure. So it is important for individuals to not let that go on too long, to consult with a trained bankruptcy professional who can advise them of a strategy to deal with their financial problems. If it's just a temporary situation, there might be one option. If it's a long-term situation, maybe a disability which prevents you from working and maintaining a job, there might be a different option. But it's important to talk about it early with a professional who can give you good advice about bankruptcy options or non-bankruptcy options, because there's a range of options. And then with respect to the types of debt, that's going to be important for your professional to know. What is the nature of your debt problem? Some debts aren't dischargeable in bankruptcy, so the act of filing a bankruptcy won't provide long-term solution. If your problem is unpaid taxes, for example, those debts aren't generally dischargeable in bankruptcy. You mentioned student loans. Student loans are not generally dischargeable in bankruptcy. There are some proposals in Congress, including from some folks running for president, who would change that. But right now, as the law stands, those debts aren't dischargeable. Credit card debt, on the other hand, is a type of unsecured debt. It's not secured by collateral. And so it is more able to be discharged through a bankruptcy process. Car loans, not so much. If you still owe on the car is the collateral. You're going to have to work something out with your creditor if you want to keep the car. And if you need the car to get to work, well, that's going to be a priority for you. So it really depends on the type of debt you have. And again, the financial advisor, the legal advisor, can help a consumer best understand what tool in the toolbox to use.
What about home mortgages? Obviously, that is so important, but there's collateral right there.
Yes, absolutely. And home mortgages, of course, were part of the crisis we had in bankruptcy filings in the 2007 to 2010 period, where filings spiked pretty dramatically. People just were in over their head on mortgages, and particularly in some parts of the country in particular, the rates of delinquency and default were just off the hook. And in some cases, the only solution was a foreclosure, and to simply walk away from the home. Many of the parts of the country that were the most impacted by the housing crisis, whether it be in Florida or Arizona or California, have somewhat recovered. Housing market is certainly better than it was during that period of time. But it's very susceptible to the sort of bubble effect, where you just have loans that are just getting too big for people to sustain. And some people, recognize the same pattern in the student loan situation, where the amount of debt has, it's over $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, and that's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable.
What about credit quality or thresholds to loan to people? Is that going down? Because we had that, as you say, during the subprime loans in the early 2000s. And is this toxic debt reemerging? I'm reading some reports that suggest it may be.
Yeah, it's volatile. It has largely recovered from certainly the financial crisis, and certainly that period, which largely was triggered by the bankruptcy filing of Lehman Brothers, which was one of the largest bankruptcies in U.S. history, which is associated with the housing crisis and the like, which had a ripple effect throughout the economy, and required extraordinary measures by the government to dig out of it. Credit quality has generally improved, and again, we've benefited from a a long period of time of very low interest rates. Interest rates were functionally zero for several years. They're still low. That makes credit available, and that's certainly been helpful to the recent economic expansion.
Samuel Gerdano is with us from the American Bankruptcy Institute. And Samuel, I know you've been very instrumental in Congress and some actions they've taken lately to provide better access to the financial fresh start of bankruptcy for primarily small businesses, veterans, and family farmers. Can you break that down for us? How important have these changes been?
Sure, happy to. This is really pretty unusual for us here in Washington. We're largely dysfunctional when it comes to legislative achievements, but these are some bills that literally were just signed into law last week by the president and passed by Congress. They were really a throwback to a bygone era of Congress when things were done on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, and really solving kind of unique problems for sympathetic groups of either individuals or businesses, small businesses, family farmers, and disabled veterans. And you can't get more sympathetic than that, I suppose. And that certainly helped get them through the process. But the three bills in particular are all public law. Two of them are effective immediately. The Small Business Reorganization Act becomes effective in 180 days, and that one I think is going to be the most consequential. It really creates for Main Street businesses similar options in restructuring that Wall Street firms have benefited from, for years. And so I think it really can be very impactful. It allows the business owner to stay in control of the business while they reorganize. It relaxes some of the Chapter 11 standards that now apply in big business cases, which are really insurmountable barriers to smaller entities. And we're talking about, $2 million businesses. These are not publicly traded companies or large real estate developments, but they are businesses who are important in communities. They employ people. They are the job generating sector of the economy. And so it's important that they have the ability, just as big businesses do, to get the fresh financial start that the bankruptcy law promises. So that's the Small Business Reorganization Act. And as I said, I think it can be really quite controversial. And I also, should give some credit to Congress. These are bills that it's an example of Congress kind of patching the roof while the sun is shining. The economy is doing pretty well, but you can't pass bankruptcy bills because you can't get consensus in an environment where there's chaos, where there's financial chaos. So, if we were back in 2008, it's very hard to get consensus on what the solution is because the problem is too big, it's too immediate, it's just overwhelming the situation. And that's really what's going on. You mentioned student loans. That's why student loans are very difficult to solve through the legislative process, that problem, because it's a huge problem. There are many different potential solutions, and the ones that simply involve just simply wiping away all of the debt like some kind of giant Etch-a-Sketch, has obviously impacts, for the taxpayers. So these other bills that just made it through don't have those kinds of problems. They are again bipartisan, and that's really the only way things can happen here in Washington these days. But it is encouraging that Congress, took the effort to get them all the way around the bases.
Can you comment on just a couple more things, and then we'll let you go, Sam? Statistics are suggesting two things, as I'm reading them, that bankruptcies are up in southern states and big cities like New York. Any logic to these numbers?
Yeah, again, the numbers are pretty volatile, from month to month. In the South, Chapter 13 has always been a more popular remedy for individuals with household debt. Scholars and others who've studied Chapter 13 largely attribute it to either state law remedies that encourage bankruptcy filings short of a non-judicial attachment and garnishment, Maybe cultural issues could be at bear there. So that has been a long-term pattern in the consumer space for Chapter 13 being popular in the South. But otherwise, cases can go up and down really anywhere. And that's because we're talking about individuals, and every individual's got a different story about their own ability to save and their job prospects and their health and the nature of their family situation. And as many people as there are, there's a different story. They're all snowflakes.
Oh, exactly. But what about like New York City or all these large urban areas that are attracting these young college students who have so much ability but so much debt, and the costs of living in these huge urban areas are so high? Is there a correlation there?
Well, there could be. Again, there's a lot of other variables to unpack there. And again, remember, if the student loan debt is the problem, bankruptcy isn't today your solution, because the debt isn't dischargeable in bankruptcy except in rare cases. So again, if that's your problem, you're going to have to look elsewhere for a remedy other than the U.S. Bankruptcy Code.
Okay. Just two more. Unmanageable debt seems to be forcing more companies to file for bankruptcy, leading to job cuts, almost 20% more than all bankruptcy linked to job cuts in 2018 in this year, 2019. Is there any way to help us explain that?
Yeah, well, clearly there are a number of sectors of the commercial economy that have been under stress. Oil and gas, energy is clearly one. Retail is clearly one. The so-called Amazon effect has affected many retailers adversely. It's very competitive, and sometimes companies, perhaps they've been through a leveraged buyout or a private equity takeover, which has added really substantially to the debt in the capital structure, and that can impact the company's ability to make their own debt payments on an ongoing basis. So similar to the individual who has to make a car payment every month when they lose their job, a company has obligations on debt service that are higher than they used to be, perhaps again because of an LBO situation, and they just simply can't make it. They can't make the payment, which means they can't do the other things to help improve their business. They can't do things to modernize or improve their website or improve their ability to compete with online retailers like Amazon, for example. And that's probably the scenario that brought Toys R Us down, a company that was probably okay, wasn't great, but it took on a lot of debt as part of a private equity buyout, and then just couldn't sustain their debt burden in the face of an increased competitive market for what they did, for what their service was, and it just wasn't sustainable, and the company just failed.
We've seen so many huge brands go out. In closing, there are a lot of ads for people to go to nonprofit counseling or this IRS Fresh Start initiative. Some companies saying that they've got a great tool to do that. I mean, what should a consumer look to in terms of good counseling and advice if they think they're on the precipice of perhaps filing for bankruptcy?
Well, we don't endorse any particular service, but the cautionary note is that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and that's been good advice, for probably hundreds of years. So again, make sure that you've kind of vetted the provider, and there are lots of ways to do that. That's one of the good things about technology and the internet these days. You can research companies and providers to make sure that they do have a high satisfaction rate from people that they purport to help, and go with reliable sources. And certainly, if you need bankruptcy counsel, there are lots of resources. And here's where we can be helpful. People who are active in the ABI and who do consumer work would be really valuable help to making the right decision for that individual.
Samuel, tell us how we can find the resources that are available through the American Bankruptcy Institute.
The best place is our website. It's abi.org. There is a wealth of information on the site, and there's a bankruptcy resources section, which provides many commonly asked questions and answers about bankruptcy and the process, as well as where to go to get more reliable information to deal with your own personal situation.
Samuel Gerdano, the Executive Director of the American Bankruptcy Institute, we thank you so much for your expertise and time today on America Trends.
My pleasure, Larry. Thank you for having me.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.